long last, the UFC has come back to Florida. Hello again, degenerates, degeneritas, and degenerati. Welcome to the MMA RAXPOD for UFC on ABC 5, also known as UFC Jacksonville, because we can't seem to agree on a hashtag for road shows these days. That's not my fault. That's not a branding issue I've got, but if you're wondering why this sport has the problem growing itself, it's because little things can't find common agreement like this. We all know UFC Vegas 76 is going to be at the Apex, but we don't know what the road shows are going to be called, and this ambiguous naming leads to problems with casuals discovering the sport and committed fans like ourselves just trying to figure out where it is. Even when the event is called UFC on ABC, it should be pretty easy, right? But the little things have a funny way of becoming difficult when money becomes involved. And that's why you're listening to a podcast about fight betting advice. So, with that in mind, we've got Ilia Topuria taking on Josh Emmett. Topuria, obviously undefeated, rising contender. I would imagine that most of the people backing Emmett at 38 years old are thinking that Topuria is a bit of a front runner. Front running is going to be the theme of this show this week, and a big thing I want to focus on with my analysis going forward, because there's a few different candidates in here this week for some sort of front runnership that have made me either stay off of fights entirely or just have to look at things a bit more in context relative to similar past favorites that I've picked that have ended up being very transparently front runners. And that relates to one of the very significant misses we had last week in both of the money line favorites that we called at MMA Rax. So I will atone for those sins before getting into the picks for UFC Jacksonville this week. So the first miss of the night was Christian Quinones, although thankfully got bailed out with the Ronnie Lawrence call. All signs were pointing to Lawrence being a very, very solid side against an inexperienced guy like Argueta. But obviously the two had been off for a little bit, close to a year, I believe, in each case. So ring rust hadn't really been a factor in the head-to-head comparison, but both of them had still been on an extended absence. The press coming out from the UFC itself had been indicating that Ronnie Lawrence had been dealing with some health issues over his previous UFC appearances that may have helped explain why he didn't perform up to the standard he or some other people were expecting. I don't necessarily think that that's why he didn't have a great showing against Yakub Kakramanov, but his takedown defense did get sort of exposed in that fight, and Argueta was very adamant about forcing the issue very quickly to put the fight on his terms, in the same way to how Pat Sabatini fought Lucas Almeida later that night. It was evident who was going to have the wrestling advantage, and the person that recognized that moved very quickly early in the fight to put the fight on their terms where it was going to be most favorable. Now, if that fight had gone the distance, which it could have, because Argueta kept squeezing guillotines to no avail and was, if you've, followed the trajectory of these kinds of fights in the past, you know that sort of inexperienced, excessive squeezing results in a sort of acidic reaction in the arms that sort of exasperates gassing out, really takes power off of punches. It would have been interesting to see if Lawrence had gotten out of that first round, even if it had ended up being a 10-8 round, which it was sort of on the path of being just because he couldn't get up at all. But if Argueta had spent 5 minutes trying to squeeze him out and Lawrence had been able to get out of everything, what would that guy have been able to do over the final 10 minutes? But Keith Peterson didn't give us an opportunity. So we took the no contest on that one, even though it was a parlay leg. But obviously with what we did get to see, could hardly call that encouraging for wanting to back Lawrence going forward against strong wrestlers that have a penchant for forcing the issue. So credit to Mr. Argueta. It's a shame that a referee robbed him of what could have been a performance bonus and what was likely a very solid start for an underdog in that one. But Christian Quinones was the first true miss, and I had talked about how Kyung Ho Kang, I thought, was not necessarily a live dog, but the line was a little bit close enough where I felt good just picking Quinones on the age gap. The age gap, which has been a great play on its face over the last year and a half, got absolutely slaughtered on this card by fighters that were considerably older, but still ended up just having career performances in some cases, as Mr. Cannonier did against Marvin Vettori. But Kyung Ho Kang looked sharper than ever on the feet, and the moment that Quinones was in a position to hit the floor, he capitalized, jumped on it, and still doesn't have a knockout in the UFC, but probably was heading that way if he wanted it, given how much sharper he looked on the feet. But got the submission win. Great for him. Didn't make that a parlay leg, so wasn't sweating it that much. But Christian Leroy Duncan, that's really what I want to get into in terms of needing to weed the front runners out of my own analysis, because, I mean, made that a parlay leg, and I was very adamant about how if that fight went to decision, even if it was murky, I still felt reasonably good that because of the promo push crunch that the UFC had been demonstrating with needing to prop up these UK fighters, they were going to be willing to do the same thing for Duncan in a fight that Duncan was effectively considering his true UFC debut. And I'm sure the UFC had to feel about it in a similar way too. Duncan had a 5-year age gap. He had an 8-inch reach advantage. And he was an undefeated UK prospect. So there were a lot of reasons to feel good about him being able to effectively fight a more well-rounded MMA match against a guy in Petrosian who had demonstrated a good volume kickboxing skill set, but not the same kind of well-roundedness we had seen from Duncan in previous appearances. But the inexperience of Duncan showed up. He, was pursuing a lot of flying techniques in the first round and literally showing his ass to Petrosian at the end of the first. And it didn't help him. I don't believe he won the first round on a single scorecard. I believe it was only the final round that he won on a pair of them because of the damage that he did to Petrosian's face. So that was very disappointing. That ended up costing parlay leg hit for the week because the Torres Mata 1.5 under hit, but the case for Duncan front running was very evident. He was a favorite coming off of his only UFC appearance. He won off of his opponent tearing a ligament in his knee. Now, even though it looked like he was going to cruise against Dorovic, it was a different environment. It was a bigger cage. He had that was much more of a favorable setup in terms of wanting him to do well, because it was literally in London than, this, which is in the Apex and a smaller cage and a more intensified microscope. And outside of Todorovic, this was probably Petrosian, the most significant challenge of his career to that point. You just got to be better about recognizing when to stay off these spots, and I put that on myself. And I went back and looked at that in context of other favorites that I had picked that had been blown parlay legs, not only this year, but last year even. And I saw about 43% of the favorites, the money line favorites that I have picked, not pick'ems, just straight like, favorite odds in excess of like the 120 range. There's always been context in terms of them having limited appearances or no success in their whole career going the distance, or just only having ambiguous results to go off of as their one primary data point, that you just can't be making them high confidence bets, even though you're looking at them with the same variables that you would a main event, where you have fighters that have, in some cases, a dozen or dozens of appearances in the UFC and more reliable tape to use in terms of figuring out what their decision-making process is going to be in a fight situation. So with that in mind, I'm really, really going to be trying to carve out a better idea of front running generally going forward, and using that as more of a fail-safe for staying off fighters like Christian Leroy Duncan. Or I wouldn't go as far as to say Blake Builder was a front runner, but at the price that he was at, I talked about last week how should have stayed off that. I'm more speaking to people like Josh Quinlan that fought at Fight Night, Simone Yadong. Another example, I think, less popular, but in the context of how he was in that fight, it makes sense. Curtis Blaydes was absolutely front-running against Sergey Pavlovich. Coming off the Aspinall win, demanding a title shot, and you call the Aspinall win literally the guy just getting a non-contact ACL injury, basically. I felt like that played heavily too, with, in terms of a lot of people talking about McGregor. That perception coming out of that Poirier had won the rivalry because of that leg injury that McGregor suffered, I think inflated his stock a bit for when the time came for him to face Oliveira. And I believe that's why Charles was the underdog in that fight. And Charles came out, he prevailed. So I took the 1.5 under on that fight in terms of parlay legs, but I put out Blaydes as a pick to win, and that was another case where I should have said, all right, this guy's favored coming off of an injury win. That's not a case where you should be betting someone. I don't care what the context is. And then, there have been others this year. If you remember UFC 287, Raul Rosas Jr. I was originally going to take the plus 1.5 on that. And it's just unbelievable that because Rodriguez missed weight, I said, I don't want to, risk him gassing out or something. So I'll just go with the guy who's the 200 favorite. That ended up being the only money line favorite. I missed the whole card, and if I had just stuck with the original plus 1.5, would have made probably like 50 units that night on the parlays. And that's just one example of many where a front runner has just completely, screwed over what was otherwise really solid work on a card. And that's like not half, but over 40% of all the moneyline favorites that I've picked across over 600 fights at this point. So I'm going to be very, very adamant about trying to filter out these front runners and defining what a front runner is and using that as a fail-safe going forward. And I'm confident that as I get better at doing that, we're going to see better results from this analysis, because if I can remove even half of that 43% I just talked about, that opens the floodgates for so many of these other parlays where these favorites that we've previously seen as strong bets have actually just turned out to be built on lies or conjecture or hype, what have you. It's important to put the numbers into context, which is why I do a technical analysis on top of, just regurgitating stats. But it's good to look at both sides of it, because numbers for an entire sport do tell a story that you can have faith in as you start to look at trends and identify them, which we will do on a larger scale in due time. But that's enough about my mistakes. I could do a whole thing about, being very, very strong on Marvin Vettori and then Cannonier coming out and setting the middleweight significant strike record. But I think enough people have harped on how suspicious it is that a 39-year-old is able to do that in context of the historical biological trends of humans, not even just in a mixed martial arts context. So congrats to Mr. Jared Cannonier. I'm sure those crystals and flat earth theory really got you over the finish line against Vettori. So I don't want to see you fight Izzy again. I would like to see you fight Pereira, but that's not going to happen, unfortunately. So, but we move on to UFC on ABC 5, live from Jacksonville, Florida. 4 hours north of what you're looking at right now, which has been cloudy and stormy down here in the Sunshine State for about the last week. Not even smiles from Amanda Ribas or Tabitha Ricci would clear these skies, unfortunately, these days. But maybe some solid fight results will brighten all of our days. So let's get right into it with a fight that I think you should skip. Cody Brundage, Cedric Dumas. So I guess Dumas was originally on the main card and was scheduled to fight an opponent that pulled out, and they were able to get Brundage's last-minute replacement. I believe Dumas was previously favored and is now the underdog based on how he performed in the wrestling and grappling department against Josh Emmett, which I think makes sense. Now, the numbers slightly edge to Dumas. When you go in and you look at more of the technical stuff, you see Brundage has more UFC experience. You see that Brundage is going to have the massive wrestling advantage. And you also notice that Dumas, I fight IQ is another failsafe that I sort of already have in terms of if I see a pattern in a fight relative to a fighter's IQ, I won't pick it if they're a favorite. Like, for example, if I recognize a fighter regularly gives their back and they're facing an underdog that has excellent submission ability, in most cases, I will probably hedge off of picking that. I did not do so in the case of Charles Jourdain versus Kron Gracie, but in that case, I recognized that Gracie's ring rust was probably going to be significant enough that he wasn't going to be able to take advantage of an active MMA fighter in a way that would result in a compromising submission. And I was correct. But that's why you put everything into context so that you can make the right decision. With regard to Cedric Dumas's fight IQ, Dumas is something of what I like to refer to as a guard goblin based on what he did against Fremd. And that's someone who does what Johnny Munoz did against Daniel Santos a few weeks ago, where once you get on bottom, if you're just recognizing that you're getting smothered, you basically just lock up your guard and you don't really make much of an effort to get your feet underneath your opponent to get separation or to turn your hips. You're really just content on mitigating damage and, if not running the clock out entirely, just making the main priority to not get absolutely beaten up, even though you're essentially conceding position and providing a visual that you are not winning the fight. You may be telling yourself that you're hunting for submissions, but effectively you're just, sitting on bottom if you're not actively, working your hips and pursuing control of one limb in, one limb out to try to get an arm bar going or a triangle. A guard goblin will just be sort of content to lay on their back and not really do as much as you need to get up. So I saw that against Fremd, and it not only makes me reluctant in backing Dumas, but it also makes me reluctant in taking the under here because I'm worried if Brundage gets him on the ground. These are two guys that each have sloppy technique, and sometimes that results in finishes getting away from fighters. And because we've seen that defensive lockdown tendency from Dumas when he's on the bottom, I don't know if you can feel confident in an under 1.5 going through here. So I'm staying off of the side for Dumas, and you can't take Brundage in the 200 range. Are you insane? This guy only beat Dalcha Lungiambula because Lungiambula had him rattled and then fell into a guillotine. And then he got Tresean Gore, who was another front-running candidate that I had picked a year ago that I should have recognized based on his only win in the UFC being, I believe, a split decision win on... it may not have been a split decision, but his only win was on a tough semifinal. And then he fought Brian Battle in what everybody effectively considered the real tough final and got beaten fairly soundly by a fighter whose stock is rapidly rising more after UFC Charlotte than what you've got with Tresean Gore. So Brundage's biggest claim to fame have both been against front runners, one of which is out of the UFC, and his other late results can't inspire confidence. The fight IQ was, I picked him as an underdog against Vieira, and he probably won the first round against Vieira on the feet, but he didn't put himself in position to win in the second round. He circled himself immediately into the fence, and Vieira used it to get in, get a takedown, and then find the submission because he was the more experienced overall combat specialist. So you can't rely on either guy's fight IQ here. If this was a pick'em, I would say you can take Brundage because the wrestling advantage was transparent when Dumas fought Fremd, even though Dumas is going to be live to knock Brundage out based on the chin. But you can't feel good picking either of these guys based on how much UFC data is there for Dumas relative to the fight IQ we've seen from both of them and the positive performances from Brundage that would justify this price tag. So don't bet this. Don't even take the under. I know Mike's MMA picks put the under out already this week and he's confident on it. It's one of my favorite cappers. Me personally, I just don't have the confidence to play it because of what I saw from Dumas against Fremd. So I'm going to be staying off that. No sale for me in that department. However, the next fight, Tetsuro Taira versus Clayton Rodriguez, I do feel confident taking a side on. Taira earlier in the week was about 230 and I believe has since floated out to around 260. So he's a big favorite, but Clayton has been entertaining and competitive, to say the least, in his own UFC appearances. I actually could have seen him at UFC 274 last year when he fought CJ Vergara, but I did not arrive to the premises until Mr. Andre Fialho was in the process of knocking out Cameron Van Camp. The early prelims that night were not that satisfying. However, the rest of the card did look great, even with the Cowboy Oliveira fight getting canceled at the last minute. So, lost a split decision to C.J. Vergara that night did Clayton Rodriguez. That was his only loss in MMA since 2015. And this guy has only ever lost in MMA by split decision. So he's had a considerable amount of success, albeit at smaller promotions. But came on Contender Series, won a unanimous decision. Got the split decision against CJ Vergara, and then fought Shannon Ross earlier this year in Australia at UFC 284 and got the finish inside of a minute. So he is no slouch. Although Tyra is undefeated, 4 years younger, and has surprisingly, despite being so young, 3 times the amount of MMA experience generally that Rodriguez does over the last 3.5 years, including all of his UFC success inside of the last 13 months. Fought Carlos Candelario in May of last year and won that by unanimous decision, and then fought the same CJ Vergara that beat Clayton by split decision at a fight night in October of last year, and got a very, very technically magnificent armbar. I remember watching that and being very impressed that Tyra was able to pull that off at such a young age for a fighter that hadn't been finished too many times. And then made quick work of Jesus Aguilar in the first round of a fight night event this year in February. So Tyra is not front running, I don't think, in this case. You can look at the experience and see how much more active he has been than Rodriguez. Rodriguez is undeniably going to be the biggest challenge that Tyra's had on the feet, and I think that's why this fight is really interesting and why a lot of people have been advocating for this should have been further up the card, but the UFC for some reason just doesn't seem to appreciate its flyweights perhaps as much as they should. Me personally, I can kind of understand it's still a bit of a shallow division at this point, although heavyweight is certainly shallow itself, but the spectacle of a 250-pound man knocking out a man of the same size compared to men half of that weight, you can understand, at least from a visual perspective, why it's easier for the UFC to sell behemoths slobber knocking each other as opposed to the rapid pace of the flyweights that the more diehard fans of the sport seem to crave. I don't know if this is going to end in a finish for Tyra. Rodriguez has never been finished, and I do think that there's a chance for Rodriguez to be the guy that's able to knock out Tyra, just because Tyra hasn't had really to go through a big moment of adversity yet in any of his UFC career. So if the fight does get to round 3 and it's 1-1, it'll be very curious to see how it goes. I do think Tyra is going to win this. I don't know if it's going to be by submission. If he does win by decision, I don't expect him to get a 30-27. I would expect Clayton to probably have more success early in the fight before Tyra's management and experience kicks in, because one of the reasons I don't consider Tyra to be front-running is that he's had a pair of successful decision results in the past, as well as a 2-round decision in the middle of 2019. So he's gone the distance a few different times in his MMA career. He's had that experience having to manage it. He's not just a guy that has coasted on finishes. I do think you can play him. I called him at 230. Obviously, the price is rising. I think you can probably play him out to the 300 range, to be honest. But once you start getting beyond that, you got to start asking yourself if there aren't much better value opportunities elsewhere on this card, even if you're just looking at favorites. So give me Tyra to win a 29-28 decision over Clayton Rodriguez. And let's see him fight someone good next. Give Tim Elliott to Tyra. Come on. Tim Elliott should not be ranked. Get him out. If we're gonna have him going, if he needs these fights, after watching him rub his elbows on Victor Altamirano on his forehead and eyebrows and get a greasy 30-27 that way. Put him in there with Tyra and let's see how that goes down and see if Tyra doesn't deserve to be ranked after that. Oh man. All right. Next fight. Jamal Emmers and Jack Jenkins. I took Jenkins 2.5 under at UFC 284 when he fought Don Shainis, who fell into a guillotine against Sadiq Youssef pretty quickly in, I believe, inside of a minute in his appearance prior. And then I believe they identified on the UFC broadcast in the aftermath of the Jenkins-Shainis fight that Shainis was caught on a hot mic effectively saying that he wasn't UFC level. He felt after fighting Jenkins. So that should tell you how that fight went. But I did feel kind of silly watching that play out because Shainis did show much better durability than I anticipated. And Jenkins was a guy who had spoken about how the reason he got his finish on Contender Series was because a fan sent him a DM and said, "Hey, I was watching tape on your opponent and saw he got cut open really, really badly in this specific area in the only other fight he got finished in. So if you target that area, you'll be able to get the finish." And that's what Jenkins did with his elbows, and he got it. But if that fateful DM had not come through on Instagram, would Jenkins have not gone to decision on Contender Series? Who knows? If this fight goes to decision between Jenkins and Mr. Jamal Emmers, it'll be funky because Emmers is probably going to have the crowd on his side, being a Florida guy. And people that are backing Emmers here in the 200 range are doing it on the basis that he's huge for the weight class. And if Jenkins' path is largely what he needed when he fought Shainis, which is a lot of control, is he going to be able to do that against a guy like Emmers? Emmers did get a 30-27 in his last fight, but he was fighting a very, very transparent front-runner candidate in Mr. I believe it was Hussein Ashkabov, who entered 23-0 over a nearly decade-long MMA career and got outclassed to the tune of a 30-27 from a fighter that had not competed in a year and a half in Mr. Jamal Emmers. And I think that's a significant thing to take into account here because has some of that front-running vibe from Mr. Ashkabov rubbed off on Jamal Emmers in this case, because Emmers, prior to that, we saw him get submitted against Pat Sabatini. And his claim to fames in the UFC prior to that were one unanimous decision win over Vince Cachero. And that's it. He didn't have any other wins. And Vince Cachero got knocked out by Ronnie Lawrence after fighting Jamal Emmers and hasn't competed in MMA since, and finished with a career record of 7-4 and a split decision loss to Ludwig Shalinian. If you remember that fateful fade that we took when he fought Johnny Munoz prior to getting cut by the UFC. Emmers also got knocked out by Julian Erosa on Contender Series in 2018. I was very, very surprised to learn, going down his history, that he did in fact beat Corey Sandhagen in 2017. He also beat Alexander Hernandez in 2013 by split decision. So there are good performances on here, but the more recent stuff is not encouraging. And I wonder how much of that, like, oh, is this guy finally figured it out, is baked into the result that we just saw, where he fought a guy that effectively got proven to be a fraud. Emmers, you look at the full scope of the work relative to the more recent success Jenkins has, I do think that Emmers is going to not necessarily be able to keep the fight on his terms for 15 minutes despite his experience. I do think Jenkins here, this fight were... Jenkins were favored here, I wouldn't necessarily feel super comfortable picking him, but because he has so much of a plus number here, and he's got more reliable recent experience, and I think he's just got a path to making it a grimier fight. I think Emmers is going to need more of a clean striking performance over 15 minutes, and I don't think Jenkins is going to allow him to get that. And I wonder how much Jenkins is going to be able to hold Emmers down because of some of the mistakes that he showed against Sheamus. But now that he's had time to correct those, or at least identify what his mistakes were, I do think that he's in a position where he'll be able to implement improvements that assist in his top control and ability to retain dominant positions. So I'm going to take Jenkins as the underdog here because I don't actually think there are a lot of really good underdog spots on this card. So give me Jenkins as my only underdog play this week against Jamal Emmers in what I expect to be a close decision, possibly a split, given, again, this fight is in Florida, and Jamal Emmers is going to be a local guy in that context. So look out for those sassy Florida Commission judges, especially if, I don't know if Chris Lee will make his way onto one of these panels or, one of the other colorful characters we've seen on the at the scorecards this year. But we'll see how that goes. Next fight will be, I mean, technically it's Trevor Peek and Shepe Mariscal, but Shepe Mariscal doesn't have any UFC appearances. I know some people are high on that guy, and they're the 1.5 under I've seen is a popular play for that fight. So if you see any other cappers advocating for that, I would encourage you to look into that. But I won't be picking that or Zumagulov, Joshua Van again because I don't have any data on Mariscal or Van relative to the UFC. So taking more of a wait and see with those guys. And then Tabitha Ricci, Jillian Robertson, as well as Amanda Ribas, Macy Barber. Those are both women's flyweight fights. I would encourage you to go find Duck Phillips on Bet MMA Tips, one of the best women's flyweight cappers in the entire database. I believe that he was on the correct side last week for the fight between Teresa Bleda and Gabriela Fernandez. He did pick Teresa. I considered tailing him on that, but decided I had enough plays elsewhere that night. So if you're looking for a play, I don't know what he's picked. I could, let's go see. I'll bring it up for you right now because I'm such a nice guy. Mr. Duck Phillips, where are you? We'll see if he's got plays on either of these this week. Does say he has picks in. And he is picking Jillian Robertson against Tabitha Ricci. So that is a flyweight, little bit of insider for you. That is a women's flyweight sharp playing Robertson, the underdog, against Tabitha Ricci this week. So tell at your own risk, but a little bit of insight you get for listening to the MMA Rack show is I'll come dig up some nice plays for you based on the free information available. But Duck Phillips, he got banned from Twitter, and it made me sad because he was a loyal supporter. And I appreciated his picks. But thankfully, he's still free and transparent on Bet MMA tips. So Gillian Robertson looks like a plus 110. Go ahead and get that if you want it. Okay. Mateusz Rebecki and Lake Radzhabov. So yeah, it's interesting if you want to make a case for Rebecki being a front runner. I think that you can, if not necessarily on his last performance, the result itself, just based on Nick Fiore not really being UFC caliber at all. Fiore, like the late resistance he showed against Rebecki was transcribed into him being the favorite against Chase Hooper based on Hooper's damage tolerance against Steve Garcia. We picked Hooper to win as a very considerable favorable grade, and Hooper crushed that fight. It wasn't even close. Fiore ultimately was illustrated to be, I saw some people saying bottom of the barrel UFC. I'm not going to go that far as to disparage a fighter, but should not have been favored against Hooper. And I don't know what you pull out of his performance against Rebecki that would make you think that, he provided some good resistance late, as much as it just was Rebecki acknowledging in the post-fight interview that he was really going for the finish hard in the first because he was a huge favorite, and he didn't really respect Fiore's gas tank. And he said, I had to re-strategize over the last 10 minutes so that I wasn't going to gas out myself and put myself in a compromising position. So he acknowledged, he said, because he was a big favorite in the last fight, he didn't necessarily approach it with the disciplined game plan that he should have, and that's why in the second round Rebecki really pivoted to only using his power and not really fighting well-rounded, and then in the third round really went after the takedowns quickly with what he had left and controlled the final round in a way where he was able to get a 30-26 on one of the scorecards. So he very, very composed interview afterwards, given the perception from some that he had a bit of a letdown result, which is why I think this line is as narrow as it is. Guys, he's very well-rounded. Power, volume in the striking. He's going to have a reach disadvantage just about every fight that he's in. But this guy reminds me, just in terms of everything that he's offering, a very, very unpolished, older Arman Sarukian. In terms of the striking that he offers, I think he's got better volume than Sarukian does. He definitely does not have the gas tank management, at least. But I do think that Rebecki, if he is, based on the performance that he fought last time, where he immediately acknowledged in the aftermath that he needs to be more disciplined about managing that at the UFC level, I think that we're going to see him fight more disciplined against a guy that very transparently does not have as much success as he does going the distance in Loic Radzhabov. There's a very, very clear path to victory here for Rebecki in terms of controlling the fight with his wrestling advantage. He's going to have opportunities to get in on the guard of Radzhabov as he's throwing the volume strikes, setting up his takedowns, and then controlling the fight on the ground, which is where he's proven that he can do that, even in the context of him previously putting himself in a position where he was concerned about gassing himself. So even if he doesn't knock out Radzhabov, I still think that he'll probably, even if he ends up conceding the second round, I can see him getting a 29-28 pretty comfortably with rounds 1 and round 3 in the similar way that we saw him do it against Nick Fiore beyond dispute. So I like Rebecki here very much against Radzhabov. I don't have him pegged as a front runner here, Rebecki, but if he does lose here, it'll be interesting to think about, what was missing here relative to what painted him as the favorite. And I think we can probably look back and say that it would have something to do with getting matched up against a guy in Fiore who ends up being proven to not really be at the UFC caliber level. And his only other appearance was against a guy named Rodrigo Ledillo, who has not fought in MMA since the late August appearance last year that he had on Contender Series against Rebecki. So give me Rebecki. I don't think I'm going to make him a parlay leg because I think there's some other plays I feel a little bit more confident about despite there being more value here, but I'll probably, put this one further up the ladder in terms of like a 5-leg or something, since we don't have a lot of underdog picks this week, and some of these lines are already a little bit juicy, but we'll get into that. Okay, Randy Brown, Wellington Turman. I'm surprised that this fight is even kind of happening. I guess I didn't really appreciate that Turman actually is dropping down in weight to get to here. So there is going to be a bit of a weight cut risk, and I think that's important to consider against a guy like Brown, who's going to have a 6-inch reach advantage and has all these offensive and defensive statistical striking advantages. I don't think Brown is going to be able to hold him down, but Brown is a guy that we've very transparently seen make a ridiculous cut down to 170 and then just inflate to an enormous size on fight day. If you remember watching his fight against Cowboy Oliveira, it was kind of a joke how much bigger he was than Alex Oliveira in that case. Turman, I think, is going to be big here, but obviously he's 6 foot, not quite the same size that Brown is, and he'll probably be wanting to go after a submission and shooting it on the inside. But Brown is a guy that we've seen, even against guys that present more of a threat on the feet than what Turman does, Brown is effective at skirting the cage and picking you apart and keeping the fight on his terms in that sense. I remember picking Chaos Williams to beat him last year, thinking that Williams was going to be able to put him out. And although Williams did get knockdowns, Brown was able to more effectively control the fight just because he was better at moving around and he had the natural range control. And I wonder how much Turman is going to struggle with that here, given the fact that he didn't have a lot of high-level success at middleweight. I mean, I think most people would say Brown presents more of a challenge than Andre Petroski does. So I think that Brown is appropriately priced at 230 here. Give me Randy Brown by decision. I wouldn't be surprised to see either guy get a submission, but I would be stunned to see Turman win the fight in any other way. All right. Neil Magny, Phil Rowe. This is another interesting vet versus, you can't call them a rising contender. It's more of a not really sure what to do with them fighters. This is another case, too, in which you've got a fighter that has considerably more UFC experience and experience and success going the distance than what the underdog offers. Phil Rowe has never won a fight by decision in his MMA career. He's lost both times that he's gone to the scorecards, but he's won by finish in pretty much every other case. He was looking a little gassy even in his last performance against Nico Price, where he was dominating pretty much the whole fight. I think Price started to show a little bit of bite back, and then Rowe was able to finish the fight, but did not look super effective doing so. Rowe is, if this fight does go distance, I believe he is a Florida guy. I could be wrong about that. But I think that was one of the reasons I was curious. No, I'm sorry. Rowe is a New York guy. I had him confused with Nico Price because they fought at, I believe it was UFC Orlando at the end of last year. So Price in that case was the Florida man I was concerned about if that fight went the distance. But Rowe, Magny is a decision machine, and Rowe just doesn't have that 3-round success to play him comfortably compared to a guy who has followed this script many times of, I'm going to make it a dirty clinch fight where you don't get to deploy your striking on the terms that you want. And I think Rowe is also a guy who is he's a guy with similar size compared to Randy Brown. I don't know how many other fighters have been able to compare to his reach advantage to where he's only going to have a half-inch reach advantage against Magny, which is next to negligible. I don't account for that, as significantly as I do someone that's got an inch advantage of at least an inch or, a couple or 3. So that in mind, Magny's got very clear path to victory by decision here. I believe Rowe has been submitted previously. He has not. So Rowe's been knocked out. He was knocked out in his MMA debut in the first round. So you wonder where his chin is going to be. But Magny isn't necessarily a guy that's always, been cracking. And late in his career, I think he is a guy that has really gotten by on his own distance management paired with volume, and then getting into the clinch and making these fence clinches always pay out on his terms, which is why we've banked on his overs in so many of his fights. And I just think that he's just going to grind Rowe up. I don't see Magny getting knocked out. It could happen in the first round. If Rowe doesn't put Magny away inside of 5 minutes, he's going to be lost in Magny's world, and Magny's going to make this look like very light work. So give me Magny by decision here. Two curious pieces of matchmaking here to end the prelims, if I'm being honest. I don't expect either of those fights to be particularly competitive. I expect the two guys with significant UFC experience advantages to give lessons to their opponents effectively. On to the main card. Brendan Allen, Bruno Silva. This is less curious matchmaking. I think this is a great fight because Silva is going to be able to hurt Allen with striking in a way that has really been the only thing that's been holding back this fighter, that people are looking at again now after the Muniz result, which became surprisingly a main event after the Krylov-Ryan Spann cancellation earlier in the evening. People are now looking at Mr. Brendan Allen and saying, this is a fighter we wrote off too early, and he's super good, and, the future and all this jazz. Future contender and whatnot. He's still got to get through a really good striker because the last pair that he's faced, it hasn't gone super great for him. I know people like to point that he was having leg kick success against Sean Strickland in 2020 before he got knocked out. But, he submitted Sam Alvey, which, cool. Malkoun is much more of a wrestler than striker, and that fight, I believe many people considered to be a bit of an ambiguous result. And some people even advocated that Malkoun really should have won and that it shouldn't have been a unanimous decision. I remember picking Malkoun based on the fact that I thought Allen was, if not necessarily front-running, just a bit inflated based off of losing to Chris Curtis and, just having that Sam Alvey submission win. But then he submitted a UFC veteran in Yatko, even though Yatko got released shortly afterwards. And then he submitted Andre Muniz, who's a great grappler and has probably the most dangerous armbar in the world. So that was a very impressive win. But again, people were pointing to, he looks great in the striking tonight. He was fighting a grappler, not a primary striker. People, I don't think, were pointing, oh my God, his striking was world-class against Yatko coming off of that result. And then again, the Malkoun result, it was more ambiguous than I think people indicated. You go back to those three and then behind the Alvey submission, and he got knocked out by Chris Curtis. So I think it's fair to say that Curtis is the best striker that he's faced since, the last year and a half. And Curtis knocked him out. Curtis did what Curtis does, which is he, rolled with the punches for a little bit, got his opening down, and then capitalized. So you wonder if there's going to be a similar script for Allen against a guy like Bruno Silva, who's going to have the striking edge, but will, very transparently have that 0-6 MMA submission record and got outclassed by Gerald Mearshart, of all people, prior to, getting the better of Brad Tavares in what some people, including myself, considered a bit of an early stoppage in light of the fact that they allowed Jeremiah Wells to, recover against Matthew Semmelsberger earlier that night. But, we don't harp on these losses. We move on. I do think that Allen is going to get the submission here. I don't expect him to get knocked out, even though I could see Silva, getting another meme result. But we've just seen too much yo-yoing from Silva relative to the better consistency from Allen of late to, I think, pick Silva as an underdog. Allen is one of my most confident grades of the card. If he stays below the 200 range, you have to hammer that. I'm very surprised that it hasn't honestly gotten out further than that, given how much enthusiasm I've seen for that fighter. I'm not going to put all my chips in on a guy who's, being lauded for improving his striking against fellow grapplers, but this would be a big win for him if he's able to even respond with some damage to Silva on the feet. But I would expect this fight hits the ground at some point, and when it does, Allen is able to get Silva into a position where Mr. Silva taps for the 7th time in his MMA career. So give me Brendan Allen to win. David Onama, Gabriel Santos. Okay, so when I speak about, the front-running context, this is a fight I'm staying off of because even though in a classical front-running sense, Gabriel Santos may not be, his only appearance in the UFC is a split decision loss. And based on the fact that a lot of people feel like he should have won and did win that fight on at least one scorecard, he should now be a more than 2-1 favorite against a guy that has, I believe, 4 UFC appearances in David Onama. Now, Onama ended up being, something of a front runner himself for one of the reasons I talked about earlier when I brought this subject up, which is guys never won an MMA fight by decision. So anybody that is coasting on their finishing results, is missing that gas tank management component, just strictly from an experience perspective, that lets you feel confident about picking them regardless of where the trajectory of the fight is. And a more experienced opponent that has gone the distance and knows how to win those sorts of fights in the eyes of the judges is probably going to have more success getting that than someone that doesn't have it. So in this case, I understand why people are so heavily leaning into Santos. There's also a bit of bad taste in the mouths, I think, of some people because Onama is a former Glory kickboxing guy. And if you are privy to the James Krause Discord stories, you recall that the infamous night or wager that sort of set off the chain reaction of desperation for Mr. Krause, to where the Nurdenbeke result happened in October. That process had started in August when an enormous play on David Onama of Glory MMA did not work out against the likes of Nate Landwehr. I took the -1.5 that night because it was a plus odds and Onama almost knocked out Landwehr in the first round. So I had a bit of a crushing result myself on that pick. Onama lost by majority decision, and just a guy with a seemingly limitless gas tank in Landwehr just gave him a problem that he couldn't deal with at unbelievable value. I believe Onama was something like a 300 value pick, maybe high 200s as a favorite. So he was front running in that result and then lost to Landwehr. You can't feel good about picking him against Santos. Santos fought Lerone Murphy and got the split decision in a fight that I think the majority of people believe Santos won. And I think watching it live, I also gave it to Santos. Murphy did have a case for winning it, but it wasn't good. And with that in mind, that goes into the UK bias for why I felt good about picking Christian Leroy Duncan last week, is because they have shown a willingness to overcorrect in the favor of maintaining undefeated promotional UK guys. They did not show that same bit of grace to Christian Leroy Duncan last week. And I wonder if it was, they already had the debut that didn't go well at 286 just because of the injury. You wonder how much of it was just Dana or whoever else, based on what they were seeing, saying, all right, we don't need to throw this guy a bone like we did Lerone Murphy or Paddy Pimblett, because we just don't see the same stuff in him that we do those guys. So Duncan's young. I think he will bounce back. And Santos did have a good showing. But again, that's his highest level fight of his career. At 230, there's so much. Wouldn't you rather play a guy like Randy Brown that has a 9 times advantage going the distance over his opponent and a 6 times UFC experience advantage over an unproven commodity like Santos against Onama, I would just sit back, watch for this, and root for Onama as one of the many strays in wake of the Glory MMA scandal, who, didn't necessarily, at least based on what we know, get directly involved with that sort of thing as, Mr. Jeff Molina may have done. So I'm siding with Santos, but no way you can feel good about that, picking that. So I'm not going to be betting it. All right. Justin Tafa, Austin Lane. I'm going to make this quick. This is a sloppy heavyweight fight, and sloppy heavyweight fights, there's a risk sometimes where they can just get weird and stall out and go the distance, but I don't think that's going to be the case here, because in every instance where these guys have been knocked out, it's happened inside the first half of the fight. There have only been 5 total results across the 24 combined appearances these guys have had in MMA where the fight has not ended in the first 7.5 minutes. And Tafa has spoken about how he wants to fight at 293, and so he needs a quick result to go out and do that. On a high-level experience and ability scale, he should be able to do that. But Lane is half a foot taller and has a half-foot reach advantage, and is going to have the tools to put Tafa out, and neither of these guys have reliable chins. It's just that Tafa is going to probably be able to get in on the guard and tag him if Lane isn't able to manage the distance as well. But given these guys both have bad chins, and this is a sloppy heavyweight fight, I think the 1.5 under is a very, very good play here. I think that's the best hedge you can take. I know a lot of people are big on Tafa, but with him being available at nearly 2-1 odds at this point, I think that you mitigate the risk of Lane getting him while he's trying to get in on the inside. Mitigate the risk that Lane catches Tafa while Tafa's trying to close the distance with volume and interior power. And I think that you just say, these guys, every time they've been knocked out or finished in MMA, it's happened inside the first half of a fight, and that's what's going to happen here too. I think this is probably the safest rounds play of the card. It's the only one that I'm deploying. Heavyweight fights, they end faster more often than any other weight class. Go figure. It's heavy guys throwing at each other. One side's already indicated that they're pursuing a quick finish. Both sides have chins and tendencies of getting finished quickly. I would not expect that this gets out of the first 5 minutes. So if you want to roll Justin Tafa TKO round 1, you could probably do that. But I'm hedging on the rounds here because I recognize with the size discrepancy in terms of height and reach that Tafa might get clipped himself while rushing in. So gets us to the main event of the evening, as Mr. Bruce Buffer would say. Although he'd say it more like the main event of the evening, sanctioned by the Florida State Athletic Commission. I don't know if they've got the same name choice that Nevada does. I should probably know that because, we're in Miami. But not important. Because I don't think this fight is going to decision. If it does, that would be very interesting for Josh Emmett. Because Emmett, the one advantage that he does have in this matchup is he has way more full fight experience than Topuria. Topuria has been to decision one time against Ayman Zahabi, which is a win that has aged somewhat gracefully, albeit against pretty mid-tier competition. And I believe Zahabi is also fighting at bantamweight now, having more success down there as opposed to, I'm not sure where he fought Topuria at, but I would assume that fight was at featherweight. Topuria has been quite a character for my analysis because, I'm sure many of you look at the unit number and you think, what the hell is that? There's untracked and there's no way that that's accurate. But what you have to understand is when you are running these all parlay strategies, the times that you win where you're completely right are going to offset the times that you're wrong, countless over and over again. And I've been wrong more times publicly than I've been right. It's absolutely the case. I haven't gotten a single clean sheet yet. The day is coming. I have had cards where I've gotten one pick off relative to the full set. The most recent example of that was, I'm forgetting what fight night it was, but it was the one where it was when Alex Hernandez beat Edmund Shabazian in the co-main. The only pick that we got wrong that night was Michael Johnson as an underdog. And that was the most recent event. Right at UFC 288, that was a pay-per-view where the only pick that I missed in that case was a rounds play on Ribeiro Holmes. And the reason I bring that up is because at UFC London last year, Ilia Topuria knocked out Jai Herbert in the second round, and I had the plus 1.5 in that fight at plus 115, which was not a good bet in hindsight, given not only Topuria knocked out Herbert, but Herbert knocked down Topuria in the first half. Topuria was lined as a 500 favorite, and in the interest of just trying to build the closest thing I could to a full card parlay, I threw that in there as a rounds play just to say, let me at least get some value out of this on what's otherwise a minus 500 line. And that one decision, those 90 seconds from hitting on that plus 1.5 cost me an 11-leg parlay that would have turned $45 into over $22,000. And that's my point with this strategy, is that it can just really come down to one mistake you make in your analysis like that sometimes. I went 8 for 8 at UFC Columbus the next weekend, and that's what really set off this enormous number that you see in the description on the Twitter account. But my point is, Topuria, with that in mind, I don't want to say he's been a villainous character, but he's a guy that has always lived in the back of my head while I'm doing this, just given, man, if he had just knocked out Herbert a little bit later, how different would life be? So it is what it is. That money long term is not something I'm going to sweat, but you do look at that and you're like, man, I could have had an 11-leg parlay. I'll live with my record being 8 for now, but 11 would have been very, very nice. Then we bet Bryce Mitchell on what we effectively graded as a pick'em to beat Topuria, and Topuria showed how misguided of a decision that was. I know there were a bunch of sharps that have been on Topuria for forever, for so long, and I kind of always just wanted to preach skepticism because of that, relative to me getting familiar with the idea of a front runner, and that definitely is not what Topuria is in this case. 300 is a lofty price tag, but it is justified. The age gap is impossible to ignore. 12 years is very significant, particularly with how we saw Emmett against Yair Rodriguez. It was only the second time in his MMA career he's been finished. It was the first time by submission, I believe. And when you put that into context of his recent results, it makes you concerned for, picking this guy even at the value that they currently have tagged on him. I took the value on him against Yair Rodriguez. I still think that was a good bet because Yair even admitted in the post-fight interview he got rocked so bad by Emmett in the first round that he was basically fighting on autopilot until it was over at that point. Yair claims he doesn't remember like winning the title itself with regard to what happened during the fight because of how hard Emmett got him in the first. But Yair turned the pressure up in response in a way that Emmett just wasn't able to handle. I think Topuria is going to be able to supply that similar amount of pressure, and I wonder if Emmett is going to be able to hurt Topuria first before he can go through and do that. And we've seen how Topuria reacts to being hurt because he got dropped by Yair Herbert and recovered well enough where I think some people even wonder if Topuria may have won that first round based on how he recovered. I think you probably still edge Herbert just based on earning the knockdown and how heavily that weighs round scoring in MMA. But obviously Topuria was turning it around, did so to start the second, and then eventually found the finish. So it's not often that you get to see an undefeated fighter go through adversity like that, and Topuria did do it. He did it when he was like a 500 favorite. So it would have been an embarrassing loss, and he did navigate through it. So he's been through a bit of that adversity, and I can respect that. Emmett, even though he's an alpha male guy, team alpha male, the wrestling is something that people have said has not been consistently deployed in these later stages of his career. And that's because as you get older, because of the drain on the gas tank that wrestling demands when you deploy it, in the first half of a fight, it becomes significantly harder to lean on that as a path to victory if it demands as such. And Topuria's wrestling is very good. He, a lot of people speak about the Georgian background, and it's the technical guys like raving about that skill set he has, honestly, more than the boxing in a lot of ways that I've noticed. So a lot of people are picking Topuria by submission. I wonder how much Emmett has left in terms of chin at this point because he has been knocked out before. And even going back further in Emmett's results, as I mentioned earlier, I was aware that he tore an ACL against Shane Burgos. I was hearing this week that he actually did, in fact, tear both of them. So in that context, it's great that he won that fight. He did beat Ige, who Ige has since rebounded from that over the last year and a half quite considerably. And then the Calvin Kattar result, a lot of people say that was a fraudulent case of where, Chris Lee inappropriately gave round 4 to Josh Emmett in a way that swung the result out of Calvin Kattar's favor. Perhaps Calvin Kattar would have gotten a title shot over Josh Emmett against Yair Rodriguez for the interim featherweight belt. If that result had gone differently, and then Kattar wouldn't have, had his knee fall apart against Arnold Allen. And you just see how one little decision like that can affect the trajectory and perception of two different careers. However, I think that in this case, Topuria is very visibly a rising contender with a lot of technical MMA cappers that believe in the skill set he's offering. And he was able to deploy that successfully against a guy that was perceived to be giving him his most significant response to date in Bryce Mitchell. Even though there was speculation that Mitchell was, sick and not necessarily in the best, state to compete in his last fight, he still went out there and showed up, and Topuria did too, and Topuria got the job done. So I expect Topuria to get the job done here too. I know the rounds under is something like 2.5. I don't think you can feel comfortable with that, given if Emmett is able to weather the early storm and drag this out a little bit. This is a 5-round fight, and Topuria's only got one fight in which he's gone the distance. If this fight gets to championship rounds, what does that look like for Josh Emmett in terms of success compared to what Topuria has to lean on? If Emmett's able to get round 4, round 5, because Topuria hasn't gotten there, and it comes down to just one round where maybe one guy got more damage off on one than the other, and it swings because of that, I don't necessarily think there's a 48-47 out of the question for Emmett here. But I would still expect Topuria to win if the fight goes the distance, just because he's got more paths to controlling the action in the actual octagon. And he's got much better finishing upside. So go ahead and play Topuria in the 300 range if you want. If he ends up ballooning out to 400, I think you probably let it go. It's a shame we've got a main event that's lined this wide, but I think in terms of, I've seen this fight described as a passing of the torch moment, and I think that's appropriate in the case of Mr. Topuria here. So it would be great if he could fight Volk. That would be fun. But we'll see how this result plays out first on Saturday night. But I want to thank you very much for tuning in once again to the MMA RAXPOD. Last week was the most listened to episode yet. Didn't quite crack 50 views, but still more than doubled what our previous best was. And this is still the beta, so we're just getting a little bit better every week and just trying to get the knowledge out there for everybody to be able to take advantage of. So I'll be back next week to atone for my sins. Once again, relative to this card, hopefully won't be too many, or at least not as many as were had with Vettori Cannonier. But for July 1st, we're going to have Sean Strickland and Abus Magomedov. Going to be a big one. If Mr. Strickland wins that, I think he's going to get a dark horse title shot against Izzy at middleweight. So that'll be fun, but won't get ahead of our skis. Still got a card this week to watch. Thank you very much for tuning in, folks. Have a great weekend, and look forward to the fights. Take care.